more people are deciding church isn't for them. They just don't see the point. It's not hard to see why.
It's a sin not to be. This fight has come to us.
You're walking right into the gates of hell.
Ever found yourself thinking we'd all be better off without religion? Here's the crazy part. Jesus agrees with you. Losing my religion.
Good morning. Good to see you guys. It sounds pretty lighthearted, right? Good times. My name is Adam. If I haven't met you, I'm the campus pastor here on our Corona campus, which means I get the opportunity to teach here most weekends. And today we're going to be starting this new series called Losing My Religion. And I think that if you stick around for this whole series, it is going to change you and your perspective of yourself and God in very powerful ways. And I also think there's probably some people in your life that need to hear this. And so my encouragement to you is to share this with other people, to give them an invite card, invite them along with you, send them a link to the video or the audio podcast. And definitely, for the sake of yourself, take some notes today. Write down some things that stand out to you. And maybe they stand out to you because you're like, I don't like that. I don't agree with that. And that's fine. My hope is that when you leave here, it sparks a conversation that you're able to have with your friends, family, and coworkers about what all this stuff means. And so before we jump into the actual sermon today, I do want to just state this up front, and that is that not all religion is bad, okay? And maybe that is not obvious to you. Maybe you assumed that that was true. But in reality, Jesus was pretty religious. He went to the temple a lot. He kept most of the Jewish laws most of the time. He was a practicing Jew, which is a very religious thing to do. But religion is prone to perversion. And so before we get into the whole series and the topic that I'm going to be on today, I want to just give you a couple definitions to start that sort of frame what we're going to talk about and how we're going to talk about it. And I want to give you a couple definitions of different types of religion. So there's good religion, right, which I would classify as like a set of rhythms and rituals formed around facilitating a healthy relationship, okay? This is what I would consider to be good religion. But then there's bad religion, okay? And this is maybe what some of us think about when we think about religion, is that bad religion is when you prioritize certain rhythms and rituals over a relationship and you hold to them even when they're hurting that relationship. It also can be like when you are insisting that what works for one relationship is required in every relationship, okay? And we can be religious about all different sorts of relationships. We can be religious about our relationship to our health and our fitness, or religious about the way that we relate to our favorite sports teams or money or our romantic partners. I'm pretty religious about my wife. I love her. I like that relationship. I want it to last for a long time. And so we have certain like rhythms and rituals that we keep in place in our life in order to maintain this healthy relationship. One of those things is that we try and carve out every single week some time to be together and to have like a date night. Sometimes that date night is leaving and going out of the house. Sometimes it's just locking our bedroom door and keeping the kids out and watching a show together and holding hands and just hanging out and talking about our lives. And that would be an example of like really good religion, right? Like a good system of rhythms and rituals that are helping this relationship and making it grow and be better and healthy. But an example of maybe bad religion in this example would be if my wife got sick one night and I started just yelling at her because she was too sick to go on the date, you know, and I'm just like, if you loved me, you would do this thing. This is proof, whatever. And I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going without you. And I just go on a date without my wife, right? Maybe I meet somebody else out there and I'm like, you know what? I'm committed. I'm committed to the religion of this rhythm, right? That would be preposterous, right? That would be like, I'm so committed to the ritual, even though it's harming the relationship. It's starting to actually have the inverse effect that it was intended to. The other example here would be, you know, if I declared to everyone else, if you don't go on a date night every Thursday in person to Chili's, you don't love your partner, okay? You have a horrible relationship, right? It's assuming that like this thing that maybe works for us has to be copy and pasted on everyone else or they can't sustain a relationship. So this is where bad religion sort of gets in the mix. And this is what I really want to do during this series is to really differentiate between these two things. Because I think what we do is we have experiences with bad religion and we assume that that just equals who God is. And it's not. It's a perversion of the way that things were meant to be. And what we're going to do during this series is sort of peel these things apart to analyze some of the things that religious people over the years have, the traditions that they've developed or have become known for that are hurting themselves, others, and God, as opposed to helping that relationship. So that's what we're going to do together during this series. So if you're still tracking with me and you haven't left yet, the title of my message is From Food Court Faux Pas to Park Bench Prayers. From Food Court Faux Pas to Park Bench Prayers. Anybody besides me, you love people watching? You can admit it, okay? I do, probably too much. I get a weird joy out of it, and a little while back, my kids are teenagers, and so they're in this phase where they're always wanting to go to the mall and get like a new outfit or just like look around for hours and buy nothing. That's fun as a parent. And so sometimes I'll just sit in the food court. Right? I'll sit in the food court and just watch people, okay? And there are some choice grade A people watching at a food court, right? And as I was people watching and stuff, I was noticing, sort of observing my own thoughts, where these thoughts were sort of rolling through my mind that I didn't realize like I was producing or choosing to think about, but they were kind of like just rattling around in there as I was looking at different people. And I'm gonna tell you what they are, even though they're not great, okay? I'm gonna be real with you this morning about what I was actually thinking. I would look at different people and just be like, man, that is a horrible parent. I can't believe anyone would parent like that. Like, that is so horrible. Like, I'm tempted just to take a picture and call CPS based on the 2 seconds I've seen from these people. They're bad people. You know, looking at somebody else and just thinking like, man, if I was married to that lady, I would drink a lot. I'm just telling you, she seems horrible. I wouldn't want to be in that relationship. Like, she seems like the worst possible person to be married to. Like, oh man, it's horrible, right? I don't want to be a part of something like that. Looking at somebody else and being like, man, that guy's got anger issues. I mean, did you see the way he freaked out about something so stupid? Like, that guy has some real problems, okay? Looking at somebody else and being like, whoa, okay, hard not to notice the low-cut top. Insecure much? I don't know what you're trying to show off to everyone, but I think that that's going to attract a specific demographic. I hope that's what you're wanting. And like, maybe as some of you are listening to this, you're like, I don't want to come to this church anymore. You are a horrible person, and that's why I didn't want to tell you this stuff. But, you know, for the sake of just being honest, like, and here's the thing. I didn't say any of these things out loud, right? I just thought them. I thought them in the confines of my own mind. I'm only saying them now for your benefit as I shame myself in the process, okay? But like, I think that we all have this sort of running commentary that is flowing through our minds at all times that oftentimes is sort of passing judgments on other people. And sometimes these things that are flowing through our minds, these thoughts that maybe we don't even recognize us as choosing to have, it's just sort of happening naturally. Sometimes this stuff can be pretty dark. Sometimes it can be pretty scathing. And sometimes there are things that we wouldn't want to say out loud to other people because we're ashamed that we're even thinking them. So why do we do it? It feels good. It kind of feels good to do. To like look down on other people, because it gives us this thought of like, listen, I don't always feel good about myself, but as bad as I am, okay, at least I'm not like that, right? I mean, I got my issues, but like, I would never do that. I would never say that. I would never go there. I would never be like that person, which makes me a little bit better. And while you've probably done this, you've also been on the other side of it. You ever walked through a food court before? Or a Walmart, or like really any other public place, and you felt like people were looking at you? You felt like they were like talking about you and whispering about you and judging you? I have. This happens to me regularly, where I can feel people just being like, I think that's our pastor. I Think that's him? Why is he wearing sweatpants in public? That outfit doesn't even match. He has a stain on his t-shirt. What's he do? He shouldn't be eating that. That's unhealthy. And you know what? It's my cheat month, okay? So I give myself 3 or 4 a year, and so you don't know what kind of plan I'm on, right? But I can feel it, right? And sometimes you look and like you catch somebody's eye and they immediately look away, and you're like, they were just thinking about me. They were just thinking, and then you have to guess what they were thinking about and judging. And sometimes it just makes us feel so horrible on the inside. But isn't this why some of the people that you know don't want to go to church? Because they're convinced that this is the exact experience that they're going to have. Everyone's staring and sizing them up and making assumptions about their story and judging the things that they think they've done and treating them like they don't belong. And it's not just people you know. This elaborate research survey study was done by this organization called the Barna Group, and it found that 57% of people who identify as non-Christians see Christians as, quote, highly judgmental and quick to find fault with other people. 57% is a high number. And I think when Christians are better known for pointing out people's pitfalls instead of their potential, we've got a problem. Because at this point, we have stopped reflecting Jesus. Jesus was assigned this nickname when he was here on earth, the friend of sinners. Because people who were very sinful in ways that everybody was aware of, they felt drawn to him. They spent time with him. They ate with him. They laughed with him. They considered him a friend. Because Jesus' priority was connecting with people, not condemning people. And that's why a lot of religious people who lived during the time of Jesus preferred John the Baptist's rigid message of judgment over Jesus' relational message of grace. And I would argue that not much has really changed. It also didn't help that Jesus said stuff like this. This is in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Jesus said, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. You will be treated as you treat others." How many of you have heard this before, right? This is a pretty common thing. Even if you're not like a churchy person or wouldn't consider yourself a Christian, lots of people are familiar with this verse. And before we get into all the judgment stuff, the idea that is unfolds here in verse 2 is all over Scripture in both the Old and New Testament. This idea that the way that you treat other people comes back on you. That it frequently comes back at you. In fact, Jesus says this in both good and bad ways. Like people that are merciful, right, they tend to experience more mercy. People that are quick to forgive other people are oftentimes more forgiven, right? And also people that are judgy tend to get judged a lot. This is sort of the way that life works, that human behavior works. And to go even further into this verse, in verse 1, this word that is translated as judge is not an English word, okay, because Jesus didn't speak English. I know this may be a shocker to some of you guys. He wasn't a white American man, okay? He was a Middle Eastern man, and he spoke a couple different Eastern languages. And specifically, the word that he uses here is a Greek word that means to cut, divide, and separate. And like a lot of words in both ours and their language, it has a couple different applications, which mean different things, right? The first one is to judge as if to discern, right? To make distinctions and decide between things. And you can't function as a human being without doing this, right? This is just a part of being alive. It's sort of assigning preferences to things that are just like, I'd rather do this and not that. I'm going to wear this. I'm going to go there. I'm going to work at this place. I'm going to choose to trust this and not that. This is just like everyday discernment. We make a lot of these distinctions every single day. But then there's judging as if to disdain, which is to treat someone as if they're less than or worse than you, and oftentimes as if God agrees with you. And it often involves putting down and excluding and marginalizing somebody else. It attempts to elevate your value by devaluing someone else, which is why we get that weird sadistic high off of it, that I'm a little bit better than them. I don't feel as bad about me if I can find just one way that they're a little bit worse than I am. And this is the kind of judgment that Jesus warns against. And here's why we do it anyway, okay? Because I think a lot of times we look at the Jesus way and it just feels so fuzzy and abstract. Like, how do we, just like love people? How do we actually do that thing? But a list of sins is concrete and easy to measure. And so we tend to prefer that more. It's hard to know how you stack up against other people in a culture of grace if we are all receiving what we don't deserve. And so as people who really enjoy the feeling of status, sometimes we reject this mode or this idea. But a strict religious code, you know exactly where you rank. And you could be kind of bad, but not as worse than them, and so you're doing pretty good as long as you highlight their deficits. And we like this. And maybe you're thinking like, well, that's not why I do it. I know some people do, but that's not why I judge other people. I do it because if Christians don't point out God's standards and make sure that people know that they're not living up to them, then who's going to do it? I mean, am I the only one who believes in truth anymore? I know what's right for everyone, and God has called me to make sure I tell them with large doses of anger and sarcasm. That is my calling from the Holy One. And while this does feel like something that Christians would do, I think the question we have to wrestle with, is it something that Jesus would do? One disciple wrote this about the reason Jesus came to earth, like the way that his mission played out, the way that his ministry played out. He writes this, in John 3:16 and 17. I'm going to read this from the Message translation. It says this: "This is how much God loved the world. He gave his son, his one and only son, and this is why, so that no one need be destroyed. By believing in him, anyone can have a whole and lasting life. God didn't go to all the trouble of sending his son just to point an accusing finger, telling the world how bad it is. He came to help to put things back together." Another translation says that Jesus came not to condemn the world, but to save the world. Another translation says Jesus came not to judge the world, but to rescue the world. Interesting. And I think a lot of what John is trying to get across here is that when you were in the presence of Jesus, the most obvious thing that you knew about him was that he loved you. You couldn't escape that fact. And I know that this could frustrate some of us because we can be thinking like, okay, so we're not supposed to confront anyone about anything ever. And that's not what I'm saying. I don't know if you've noticed, but most people don't seem to respond super well to unsolicited advice. Hey, I don't know you, but you should do this because you're horrible and this would fix everything. Most people aren't like, thank you so much, stranger. That's not how it goes. You know, a Barna Group study again found that what frustrated outsiders from the faith most about Christians wasn't their perspectives, but the way they communicated them. Think about that for a minute. In fact, they were able to, through these thousands of interviews and in this survey, they were able to really pare it down to like really 4 mistakes that people who don't identify as Christians think that Christians make that actually turn them off to the message of Jesus. And I'll just give them to you so you don't have to guess or look up this study, although you can. The first is wrong context, right? They're confronting in the wrong context. It's perfectly fine to like confront somebody about something, but context is everything. Maybe while you're giving a speech at your cousin's graduation isn't the time for you to tell him he probably shouldn't be sleeping around. That's not a great moment. And I'm sure we all have stories of like, it wasn't that I didn't need to hear that looking back. I didn't want to hear it at the time, but it was the context that it was done in that just completely turned me off to it. The next thing is that they said that it's the wrong approach, right? Which might include like yelling at someone through a megaphone on their way to work. I don't know that that would encourage me to do anything other than break that person's megaphone, okay? It's just the wrong approach. Sometimes there are people who can tell us the same thing as somebody else, but they do it in such a different way that we're like, oh, yeah. But some people, the approach just prevents us from hearing any of their content, anything that they are actually saying. Wrong motivation, right? It's not that what they're saying is maybe completely untrue, but you can tell that they're doing it to feel smarter and more superior and like their side is winning. When someone's telling you something and you can tell they're doing it just to make you look stupid, aren't you like, oh, I'll double down on my stupidity. Ho, ho, ho! You will not dominate me, right? We get this sense like, you don't really care about me and my life. Like, you just want to prove a point and feel good about yourself. And then the fourth thing is no relational connection, which would be like blasting somebody with one of your opinions about what they should do that you just met like the first week in a Bible study, or that you don't even know on Facebook, which is like our culture's most favorite thing to do now. Ineffective. Because in the mind of Jesus, a relational connection is a requirement of healthy confrontation. And Jesus talks a lot about this. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, he says that if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you, and if they listen, you've won them over. And this is really addressing, interestingly, all four of the things that we tend to do wrong, right? Brother and sister indicates that there is a relationship with these people. In other words, if you're trying to aggressively confront and attack somebody that you don't have a close relationship with, that you would almost consider them family, it's probably a confrontation you don't need to get involved with right now. You know, I don't really have this sense that I need to hold everyone who's not in my family to my family values because they're not family members. And Jesus seems to believe the same sort of thing, that it's the close relational connection that gives us the ability to reach out. This idea of like just the two of you, like privately, not publicly, I think this addresses this idea of content and approach, right? That like you are going to this person in the context of just the couple of you, and that you're approaching them as like, hey, I don't want to embarrass you. I'm not here to shame you. I just want to talk to you about something that is worrying me about your life. I could be wrong, but I feel like this is taking your life in a wrong direction. And obviously, like you're my brother, you're my sister, like you know the kind of relationship that we have. I'm worried about you. I don't want you to mess up things in your life that you can't undo later. And then this last thing, like you can win them over, is speaking to, I think, the motivation. Because the motivation isn't to shame the other person into submission, but to win them over with love, to win them over with compassion and care. This is what love looks like. In fact, every time love is described in Scripture, it always, in the New Testament, always points to Jesus and in very radical ways. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, it says this, that we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us, and we're to give up our lives for one another. And I think sometimes we can hear this and be like, I would do that. I would take a bullet for somebody I love. That's great. Hopefully no one's shooting at them. That seems like a very rare instance. But in the mind of Jesus, laying down your life wasn't as much about dying for someone else as it is about dying to yourself daily. And notice that Jesus invites you to take up your cross, not to nail someone else to theirs. And this is a way that we often misunderstand what Jesus is about and what he's leading us toward. What does it actually mean to lay down your life for someone else? I think it means things like communicating someone's unimaginable worth by sacrificing on their behalf. It looks like serving someone who frustrates you. It looks like forgiving someone who hurt you and still isn't sorry. It looks like refusing to make assumptions about other people's motives. It looks like choosing to lose an argument for the sake of a relationship. It looks like refusing to believe that another person is evil simply because they don't agree with you on everything. It looks like validating somebody else's pain in the moment without giving into the impulse to say, what did you think was going to happen? I told you so. This is what it is to die to yourself. And if you are a Christian, if you call yourself a Jesus follower, you do not have an option. The Apostle Paul, who has really framed most of our Christian theology, is credited with writing most of the New Testament. He says this, and I think this is one of the most powerful statements in the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, he says this, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. I don't know what word stands out to you in this, but it's the word only to me. The only thing? Like I pause and think, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. That's a big statement. Let me ask you this. Do you live like this is true? Like the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love? Or do you act like the only thing that counts is making sure that other people know how bad they are? The only thing that counts is making sure that my political party gets into office. A lot of things, the things that we think count, all the writers of the New Testament, including Jesus, would say, you have missed the point. And I get that maybe for some of you, this sounds kind of like a cop-out. Like, you're just like, ugh. I hate it when people are like, we just need to love people. You know what I mean? It sounds so wishy-washy. You mean like roll over and be overly sensitive and weak? No, that's not what I'm talking about at all. Loving people well is the hardest thing anyone could ever do. And we don't have to even guess what it means, right? It's not just like this elusive, abstract concept of like, just love. It's like, well, what does that mean? This is what's so beautiful about the New Testament is we're given an exact definition. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 4, it says this, love is patient and kind. It is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. Some of you are like, I'm out already. Man. And there's still a couple more verses, so that's alarming. It isn't irritable. Man, that just crushed a lot of us. It keeps no record of being wrong. Are you serious? It does not rejoice about injustice, but whenever the truth wins out, love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. And here's what the Apostle Paul is saying here. If this isn't how you're treating people, it's not love. So how does Jesus do this? I think a lot of times we think the love of Jesus is sort of only demonstrated in his crucifixion, but I think it's present in his every interaction. And I want to just give you like one really quick basic example. This is in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 6. It says that Jesus went to the home of Simon, a man who had leprosy. And while he was eating, a woman came in with a jar of expensive perfume and poured it over his head. And the disciples were indignant when they saw this. What a waste. In fact, this is the moment that it tells us later on that Judas was like, I got to go turn him over and sell him out. How dare he? Now, I want to give you a little bit of context here. Jesus is eating with a leper. This ought to stand out. Leprosy back in this day, it's still pretty brutal, but it was like, back in this day, it was a death sentence. If you got leprosy, people steered clear of you. They were afraid of you. In fact, you were obligated to live outside the city. It's weird that this guy even has a house, okay? There's something else going on in his life. And if you had it, and then you couldn't just be like, well, I'm better now. People are like, I don't trust it. You were mandated by cultural law to live outside the city gates. And in fact, you weren't to eat or drink with anyone. You weren't to touch anyone. And if anybody came near to you or you came near to them, you literally had to shout at them the words, I'm unclean. This is in the Old Testament. Aren't you glad you don't have to announce the ways that you're unclean every time people approach you? I am. Ahoy from a gossipy glutton. Just want you to know the kind of person. Hey, before you guys come over here, just want you to know I steal a lot of office supplies from work. I just want you guys to So no, sometimes I dine and dash. I do it. And before you come over here, I just want you to know, unclean. This is how these people lived their entire lives. And the point of this story is that Jesus ignored the religious rules and reclined at the table of someone everyone else rejected. And even that was interrupted by someone that everyone else thought even less of, a disreputable woman, most likely a prostitute who comes in and pours perfume on Jesus. The whole point of this story is that, like every religious person would say, Jesus shouldn't be there interacting with them. But here's the thing I take from this. This is not a story about then. This is a story about now, because it's a story about always. Every culture has its lepers. It's pariahs, right? It's undesirables. It's outcasts and untouchables. And Jesus insists that his followers aren't to avoid them, but to adopt them. And this is what he models in his life. And not just adopt them, but to adopt them with no strings attached, which is really hard for us to do. And those in the Simon story who imagine that they are closest to God are the only ones in the story who are judging Jesus. Think about this for a minute. The Pharisees in this story accuse God of being unspiritual because he insists on relating to people in ways that were against their religion. Like, you're a little bit off track when you're like, you know who's unspiritual? God. If I saw him walking through a food court, he's doing everything wrong. God, you should not be relating to those people. God, the way you're relating to those people is against God. And God's like, I am me. What are you talking about? And yet, we buy into this frequently. These people hate Jesus for doing this because his actions threatened their sense of superiority. And so they stalked him, they scrutinized everything he said and did, and they hoped he would screw up so that they could pounce on him and condemn him. And by the way, if this is how unchurched people experience you, you were doing it wrong. If you regularly look down on other people, talk behind their backs, and strategize about how you can put them in their place, you are not a disciple, you are a Pharisee. Maybe you're thinking like, okay, I get it. You've been pretty harsh. We're not supposed to judge. Loud and clear. What are we supposed to do then? Like, what are we supposed to replace that sinful impulse to treat someone as if they're less than or worse than you with? Like, what do we sub in for it? And this is Jesus' suggestion in Matthew chapter 7, right where he tells us not to judge. He goes on to tell us what to do. His suggestion is that you begin to treat other people as if they were you. The way he says it is this, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is another verse that we love to manipulate. My kids used to tell me that the way this verse went was, do back to others what they have done to you. And I was like, that is not what it's saying. That's why I punched him in the throat. He punched me, and it's his way of saying, please do this back. I'm like, you guys are misinterpreting this whole thing. Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. Because this really is going back to the principle in verse 2, right? That the way that you treat other people always comes back on you. And a lot of times we treat people in other ways we would never want to be treated. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is that we abandon judgment and condescension by sacrificing to show love to those we're tempted to look down on. This is what Jesus calls us to do, and this is hard. It's so hard, in fact, that you cannot love people like God wants you to without God's help. In fact, you can't love other people the way you want to be loved, let alone the way Jesus loves them, without God's help. Both of these things require God to help you. And how you treat someone always starts with what you tell yourself about them, which is why the little thoughts that we have in a food court in the confines of our own mind matter. Even if we never voice them, those things will begin to leak out in our actions, in our speech, because we're filling our heart and meditating on dark things and dark judgments. And the more you put people down and exclude them and shame them in your mind, the more likely you are to do it with your words and actions. This is why the Apostle Paul tells us, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, that we capture our rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. In other words, God is not upset that this random thought floats through your mind. You're like, ooh, that's dark. What God is frustrated about is when you're like, yeah, let's think about that. Ugh. They are gross. They are despicable. I am a little bit better. It's when we sit in that place that it begins to get dark. And God says that we actually have the ability, when a thought floats through our mind, to decide whether to hold on to it or to push it aside. That we have to capture these thoughts and make them obey Christ. And Christ commands us to give love to those we're tempted to look down on. Maybe you're wondering, like, how do we even do this? And it makes me think of this time I saw my grandpa. He had this park across the street from his house, and I'd go stay with him. And this one time I was at his house as a little kid, and I was looking out across the street, and he was sitting on this park bench, and he was sort of looking out at the people in the park, and he was mumbling to himself. And, I was 8 or 9. I had this thought of like, oh, here we go. Grandpa's going crazy. And I went over to the park, and I sat next to him, and I was like, hey, Grandpa, I saw you mumbling. Like, what are you doing? And he said, I'm just watching people and praying for God to help them understand how much he loves them and how valuable they are, and praying that they would be able to live the rest of their day out of that reality. And I was like, I was 9, so I'm like, that's so deep, I don't even understand what you're saying right now. But I was like, does it work? And he's like, I don't know if it does anything for them, but the more I do it, the more I feel love for people who used to annoy me. To which I said, do I annoy you, Grandpa? And he said, who wants ice cream? And I was like, wait a minute. Sorry. And here's what I wonder. I wonder if we decided to do this. I wonder if we decided to take what Jesus and Paul and my grandpa did seriously. I wonder how it would transform us and the world around us. I wonder how it would make people think about who God really is, as opposed to the false image that people have gotten of him through bad religion. And this is why this is my challenge to you this week. If you're new, I like to give homework out. So this is your homework for this week. And it's to do this, to sincerely apologize to someone you've treated judgmentally and to speak life into them. To replace that judgment and negativity with encouragement and potential. Because everybody is a mix of a lot of different things, and the things that we point to and speak to tend to grow. Imagine if somebody that you knew thought down on you came to you this week and said, I know there's been weirdness, and I just want to own, like, I have not treated you well. I've looked down on you. I've been arrogant. I've been mean to you. And that's not who I want to be. And I don't want my mistakes and my humanness and my judgmentalness to get in the way of how you think God sees you. In fact, this is what I think God sees when he looks at you. This incredible thing, this amazing trait, this potential that you have. That's the things that I want to highlight and underscore and uplift in you. I think that it would have a profound impact on you. I think it'd bring healing to you. This is why I want you to do it for them. And I think when you do this for somebody else, it's going to transform you too. Because when we show more love to people, we feel more love for people. That's how it works. Like, the more we push ourselves to actually love others well, the more it begins to change our mind and emotions about those people. We do this by choosing to see us as them. And when we do, it enables us to drop our disdain and to love like Christ. And this is what transforms the world. When we choose to drop our disdain and love like Christ. And this is my prayer for all of you here today. One, it's for those of us who have been wounded and hurt by the church, and I've got plenty of those wounds too. And my hope is that you can separate what people did to you and blamed God for from who God actually is and how he sees you. That God would bring healing to your life. That he would repair your perception of who he is. And the second thing I want to pray for you is that God would empower you to actually take this step of choosing to believe that the only thing that matters is faith demonstrating itself in love, that this would be your priority, your focus, and that as you do this, people would come to see Jesus as he really is, and it would transform them and everything around them. Would you bow your heads across this room this morning? I just want to pray this into your lives today. God, thank you so much for the way in which you love us, for the way in which you see us. God, we know that you know what is ultimately right and wrong about and with everything. And yet, the first thing that we ought to know about ourselves in your presence is that you love us, is that you made us, is that you are enamored with us, that you want what is best for us, that you don't just want us to sort of follow along all these rules and rituals, that what you want is a relationship. And there are some religious practices that will help that relationship, and you want to open our eyes and sync our behavior with what that is. And there are things that we have adapted and adopted that are in the way of our relationship with you. And you are asking us to push those things aside so that we can see and experience you clearly. God, I pray that you would bring healing into the hearts of people who have been broken by bad religion. And God, that you would wake us up to your love, that it would inspire us and motivate us to live and love like you, and that doing that would change the world around us. In Jesus' name, amen.